The war had ended, but the scent of blood still clung to the earth like a ghost refusing to be forgotten. John Scarlett, the man they called a hero, walked through the ruins of what once was a thriving village, his boots crunching over shattered bricks and memories lost to fire. The metal on his chest felt heavier than the rifle in his hands, a weight he neither asked for nor wanted. He had fought, he had bled, and now he had won. Yet victory did not taste of triumph. It tasted of smoke and sorrow. He passed the hollow shells of homes, their walls blackened, their windows empty, eyes staring at a world that had failed them. And then, amid the wreckage, he saw something out of place, a flash of color in a world drained of life. A single rose. It grew defiantly from the cracks of a broken cobblestone path, petals red like the blood he had spilled, yet untouched by the devastation around it. John knelt, fingers brushing the delicate stem, as if touching something so fragile would ground him in a way war never could. Behind him, a voice stirred. "You shouldn't be here, soldier," a woman said. John turned sharply, instincts honed from too many battles ready to react. But what he saw made him freeze. She was young, barely in her 20s, with auburn hair tangled from dirt and sweat. Her eyes, sharp and wary, were the color of autumn leaves. She held no weapon, but there was defiance in her posture, a survivor's strength. "This was your home," John guessed. "It was," she answered, "before your war burned it down." Guilt tightened around his throat. He had seen the orders, heard the justifications. The enemy had been here, using the village as a stronghold. But in war, bullets did not distinguish between soldiers and civilians, and neither did fire. He stopped. What could he say? Sorry? That word was too small, too meaningless against the ruins of her life. Instead, he reached out and plucked the rose from the ground, careful not to damage it. He held it out to her, the only thing in this broken place that still carried beauty. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she took it. "I don't need gifts from killers," she said, but she did not let go of the flower. John nodded. "Then take it as a promise. I'm done fighting. No more war." She scoffed, not believing him. "And what will you do instead?" "Build what you destroyed." For the first time in years, John considered a future beyond the battlefield. "Maybe," he said, "if you'll show me how." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then she turned, walking toward the remnants of her past, the rose still in her hand. John followed. The days that followed were filled with silence and work. John had never built a house before, but he had spent years destroying them, and there was a bitter poetry in learning to reverse that. The woman, whose name, he learned, was Elise, did not speak to him unless necessary. She gave him a shovel, a hammer, and a task, then left him to it. At first, the villagers, the few who had survived or returned, watched him with suspicion. Some spat when he passed. Others muttered curses, calling him a butcher, a monster, a man who did not deserve to walk among them. John did not argue. He accepted their hatred as if it were a burden he had carried long before stepping into this village. He did not try to defend himself, did not utter a single excuse. Instead, he worked. He lifted broken beams from collapsed homes, patched walls, and dug foundations where fire had left only ash. He did what he could with hands trained for war, but now repurposed for rebuilding. Elise remained distant, though she allowed him to stay. She had lost everything: her family, her home, the future she had once imagined. And yet, she did not leave. Each morning, she appeared with quiet determination, showing him where repairs were needed, handing him nails or wood, sometimes even working alongside him in silence. The rose he had given her remained in a small glass jar by her window, the only bit of color in her otherwise gray and broken home. One evening, as the sun bled across the sky in deep hues of crimson and gold, John sat on the steps of what used to be the village's main square. His hands were raw from work, his body aching in ways the battlefield had never left him. Elise sat beside him, uninvited but not unwelcome. "You don't talk much," she said. He glanced at her. "Never had much to say." She exhaled, brushing dust from her hands. "You were a soldier." It was not a question. John nodded. "You did terrible things, Another nod. Elise looked at him then, truly looked at him, as if searching for something beyond the uniform he no longer wore. Why are you really here? John hesitated. He could have said it was guilt, and it would not have been a lie. He could have said he wanted to make amends, but that felt too easy. Finally, he answered, I don't know who I am without war. Elise studied him, the firelight from a distant home flickering across her face. And you think building houses will change that? Maybe, John admitted. Maybe not. But it's better than doing nothing. She considered his words, then stood. Then get up, soldier, she said, offering him her hand. The roof on the baker's house won't fix itself. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, John smiled. He took her hand and let her pull him to his feet. And so, he built. Weeks turned into months. The village slowly came back to life, brick by brick, beam by beam. Where there had once been ruins, homes stood again. The people still eyed him warily, but some began to nod in passing. A few even spoke to him. Elise, too, changed. She still carried the weight of loss, but she no longer avoided him. They worked together, shared meals in exhausted silence, and sometimes, when the evening was calm, they would sit by the river that ran behind the village and watch the water carry the past away. Then, one night, a stranger came to town. He was a soldier, like John had been. His uniform was different, but his eyes were the same. Hard, hollow, carrying ghosts. He stood in the village square, his rifle slung over his shoulder, watching, waiting. John approached him cautiously. Something I can help you with? The soldier smirked. Didn't think I'd find you here, Scarlet. Elise, who had been nearby, stiffened at the name. She looked at John, her expression unreadable. John's hands curled into fists. I don't go by that name anymore. The soldier's smirk widened. Maybe not, but some people haven't forgotten. They're looking for you, John, and they're not the forgiving type. Elise stepped forward, her voice sharp. Who are you? The soldier barely spared her a glance. Someone who remembers what he did. He turned back to John. You can play the builder all you want, but you can't erase the past. Sooner or later, it's coming for you. With that, the soldier turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. John stood there, motionless. He could feel Elise's gaze on him, feel the weight of unspoken questions pressing between them. Finally, she asked, Who were you? John exhaled, staring at the ground. Someone I don't want to be anymore. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, to his surprise, she picked the rose from her windowsill, the one he had given her all those months ago, and placed it gently in his hand. Then don't be, she said. John looked down at the rose, then at Elise, and for the first time, he truly believed that maybe, just maybe, he could be someone new. The weight of the rose in his palm felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried all the choices he had made, all the blood he had spilled. John closed his fingers around it carefully, feeling the softness of its petals, the sharp bite of its thorns. He exhaled slowly. The past was coming for him. It always did. Elise watched him, waiting. He knew she had every reason to cast him out, to fear him. The war had taken everything from her, and he had been one of the men who helped wage it. But she hadn't turned away. Not yet. John finally met her gaze. I don't know if I can outrun it, he admitted. She crossed her arms, considering him. Then don't run. Stand. A small, bitter chuckle escaped him. You think it's that simple? Elise arched an eyebrow. Isn't it? John sighed. They won't just let me go. If they've come looking, it means they want something from me. Or they want me dead. Then we fight. That made him turn to her sharply. We. She didn't flinch. You helped rebuild my home. Helped rebuild all of this. She gestured to the village, to the homes that had risen from the ruins, to the people who had begun to live again. If they want to take that from us, then they'll have to fight more than just you. John shook his head. These people don't owe me anything. They shouldn't have to pay for my past. They already paid, Elise said, her voice harder now. Your war burned this place to the ground, but you're helping bring it back. I don't know if that makes you a good man, but it makes you someone worth standing with. He swallowed. He wasn't sure he believed her, but he wanted to. The next day, he prepared. The soldier who had come looking for him was just the beginning. More followed. Men wearing the remnants of old uniforms, faces hardened by war. They came in small groups, first scouting, then demanding. They spoke of debts unpaid, of enemies still lurking in the shadows, of unfinished wars. John met them each time, refusing to be drawn back into their violence. He made it clear. He was done fighting their battles. He had chosen something else. But war had a way of refusing to let go. One night, the sky burned again. Flames erupted in the northern part of the village, licking hungrily at the wooden homes John had helped rebuild. Screams cut through the air. The enemy had come not as soldiers, but as raiders, seeking to remind him, and the village, who he used to be. John grabbed his rifle. He had sworn he was done fighting. But some battles weren't fought for a nation or a cause. Some were fought for home. The first shot rang through the night. John dropped to one knee, steadying his aim, and fired back. The raiders moved through the streets, torches in hand, but they hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't expected the people to fight back. Elise was among them, standing atop a collapsed wall, hurling a lantern full of burning oil at their attackers. The flames roared to life, forcing the raiders to scatter. Others in the village joined the fight, farmers with pitchforks, blacksmiths with heavy iron tools, hunters with their old rifles. John moved through the chaos like a ghost, his instincts honed from years on the battlefield. He was no longer Scarlet the soldier, fighting for a cause he barely understood. He was John, fighting for something that finally mattered. When the last raider fell, silence settled over the village, broken only by the crackling of dying flames and the labored breathing of those who had survived. Elise stood beside him, blood on her hands, soot on her face. She looked at John, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her eyes. "You stayed," she said simply. John nodded. "I did." She glanced at the destruction, at the homes that would need rebuilding yet again. "So what now?" John looked at the village, at the people who had fought beside him, at the home he had found in the ruins of his past. "We rebuild," he said. "Again." And so they did. The battle had been won, but the scars remained. The village, though battered, still stood. The people, though bloodied, still breathed. And John, for the first time in a long time, felt as if he belonged to something worth protecting. They worked through the night, dousing embers before they could spread, clearing debris, tending to the wounded. Elise moved among them, bandaging cuts, calming frightened children. The villagers, once wary of John, now looked at him with something different. Not quite trust, but no longer fear. By dawn, the dead had been buried. The fires had been smothered. The village still stood. John sat on the steps of the half-rebuilt inn, his rifle resting against the wall beside him. He felt exhaustion settle into his bones, deeper than any battle fatigue he had ever known. Elise approached, a cloth in her hands, wiping soot from her arms. "You're still here," she said. John looked up at her, his mouth quirking into the faintest smile. "Didn't have anywhere better to be." She huffed a quiet laugh, then sat beside him. They watched as the villagers moved through the square, picking up what was left, salvaging what they could. "You meant it, didn't you?" Elise asked after a long silence. He turned to her. "Meant what?" "That you're done with war." John exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I meant it." Elise nodded, staring at the horizon, where the first hints of sunlight cut through the morning mist. "They'll come again, you know," she said. "Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not for a while. But they will." John had no doubt. War left ghosts, and his past was filled with them. "So what do we do?" Elise asked. John thought for a moment, then looked around at the village, at the people who had fought and bled to keep it standing. "We prepare," he said. The next weeks were spent reforging the village, not just rebuilding, but fortifying. John trained those who were willing to learn. He taught them how to fire a rifle, how to set traps, how to move unseen in the shadows. The hunters took to it quickly, their skills easily adapted. The blacksmith forged weapons, crude but deadly. Even the farmers learned to fight, turning tools into instruments of war. It was not an army. It was something better. It was home, refusing to be taken. Elise trained alongside them, stubborn and relentless. She refused to be left behind, refused to be anything less than prepared. John watched her with something he couldn't quite name. Pride, admiration, something deeper. And the rose she had given him remained, pressed carefully between the pages of his journal, a reminder of what he fought for. Months passed. The raiders did not return, but John knew better than to mistake silence for safety. Then, one evening, as the last light of the sun dipped below the trees, a scout came running into the village, breathless, his face pale. "They're coming," he gasped. "And this time, they're bringing an army." The village stood still, the weight of those words settling over them like a storm cloud. John stood, rolling his shoulders, feeling the old familiar tension settle into his muscles. Elise stood beside him, her rifle slung over her shoulder. "You ready?" she asked. John looked at her, then at the people behind them, at the village he had come to love. He nodded. "Let them come." The night was still, too still. The wind did not move, and the world held its breath. John stood at the edge of the village, staring into the dark tree line where the enemy would come. He could feel them before he saw them, shadows shifting, steel glinting under the moonlight. The raiders had not forgotten him. They had not forgiven him. And now, they were here to finish what they had started. Behind him, the village stood ready. Not as an army, but as people unwilling to be broken. Farmers clutched their makeshift weapons. Hunters steadied their bows. The blacksmith had forged what he could, daggers, spear tips, iron spikes set into the ground where the raiders might charge. Elise stood beside John, her rifle in hand, her breath slow and steady. "They have the numbers," she murmured. John nodded. "We have something better." The first arrow whistled through the air. A warning. A challenge. John raised his voice, carrying across the open space between them. "You've come a long way for a dead man." A figure stepped forward from the tree line, cloaked in shadow, but John recognized the stance, the arrogance. The leader of the raiders, one of his old commanders. "You owe a blood debt, Scarlet," the man called back. His voice was rough, worn with years of war. "There's no hiding from it." John exhaled. "I'm not hiding." He took a step forward. "But you should be." The raiders charged. John raised his rifle and fired. The first wave hit hard. The enemy surged forward, screaming, steel flashing under the moon. But the village was ready. Traps snapped shut, hidden pits swallowed men whole, and arrows rained down from rooftops. The villagers fought, not as soldiers, but as people with something worth protecting. John moved like a ghost through the battlefield. His rifle cracked with each precise shot, dropping men before they reached the heart of the village. He fought not with the cold detachment of a soldier, but with the fire of a man who refused to let his home burn again. Elise was beside him, fast and fierce, reloading with practiced efficiency. She shot a man before he could strike John down, and for a brief moment, they exchanged a look. Understanding, unspoken gratitude, something deeper neither dared name. The raiders began to falter. They had expected an easy victory. They had not expected a village that refused to break. John found himself face to face with his old commander. The man sneered, swinging a heavy blade. "You were a killer once," the man growled. "You think you can wash it away?" John blocked the strike, twisting the man's arm and sending the blade clattering to the ground. He drove his fist into the man's gut, sending him sprawling. "I'm not washing it away," John said. "I'm building something better." The commander scrambled for his weapon, but Elise was faster. Her rifle cracked. The man fell, still and silent. The battle was over. Dawn broke over a village still standing. The dead were buried. The wounded tended to. The raiders had been driven off, their numbers shattered. John stood at the edge of the village, watching the sun rise over the treetops. He felt Elise step up beside him. "It's over," she said. John shook his head. "It's never over." "But it's ours," she countered. He turned to look at her, the weight of everything they had fought for settling between them. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the pressed rose she had given him so long ago. It was faded, fragile, but still intact. He placed it in her hand. "You once asked me who I was," he said. "I think I finally have an answer." Elise looked at the rose, then at him.
And
John exhaled, the weight of war lifting from his shoulders. I'm home. The village, battered but unbroken, stood behind them. The future stretched ahead, uncertain, but theirs to build. And for the first time in his life, John Scarlett was not a soldier. He was something more.